Good evening, everyone. My name is Jody Olson, and I'm the Community Engagement and Partnerships Coordinator in Wayzata Community Ed. And I'm happy to welcome all of you to our session on supporting children with anxiety. Please note that the session is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So it's helpful if people enjoy it, they want to watch it again, or if you'd like to recommend it to someone, it will be on our Parenting with Vision website. And we can send that link out with some materials. I'll be monitoring the chat, and if you have questions that you would like to ask, please put them in the chat and I will be capturing those, and there'll be time at the end of the presentation for us to have Claire address those. And speaking of Claire, our presenter this evening is Claire Lowe. Claire is a school services therapist with Relate Counseling. Relate is a nonprofit mental health center that serves children, teens, and adults and families. Relate therapists are co-located in our schools to meet the needs of youth and our families in our district, and we are so fortunate to have them as partners. And I feel really fortunate that we're able to have Claire with us. Claire does serve maybe 2 schools in our district. So we're really, really fortunate to have her here with us. So welcome to all of you, and a special welcome to Claire. And Claire, I'll hand it off to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jody.
Mm-hmm.
So as Jody mentioned, my name is Claire. I am a school-based therapist with Relate Counseling Center, and I specifically work in Birchview and Greenwood elementary schools. So I split my time between the two. And we're going to talk all about anxiety and kiddos today. And we've got a lot to cover. So we'll have, as Jody mentioned, time at the end for any questions that come up, because there's going to be quite a lot of content we're going to get through today. I'll talk about a little bit more about Relate, just go over a little bit about anxiety. Hopefully most of that will be a refresher. There's a few things I do want to kind of touch on in terms of what to look for with anxiety and certain kinds of symptoms that people don't always think about. And then we're going to dive into the brain, what's going on neurologically in the brain, the role of cognitions in anxiety. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the gut, sleep, and movement, which are 3 areas that aren't often discussed by therapists when we talk about anxiety, but are really, really crucial for thinking about what's going on with anxiety and how we can best serve and support kiddos. And then we're going to go through research and kind of points on all of that. And then we're going to talk about, for all of those different ways you as a caregiver can respond to a kiddo who's struggling with anxiety. And then we'll briefly talk about when do you need to seek additional support? And then time for questions. So Jody mentioned most of this. We provide a lot of services in the Western Metro. We do have 2 outpatient offices in Minnetonka and Eden Prairie, serving very little kids to pretty much the whole age range here. And then we do also have these co-located mental health services. And we are in every single school in the Wayzata district, and some of our schools even have multiple therapists, particularly when we get to those middle and high school ages. So just a brief disclaimer, I do want to note that the information provided today is really intended for educational purposes. We will discuss specific ways you can respond and kind of those tips and tricks, but please note that what we talk about today isn't intended to be a substitute for any kind of treatment or diagnosis. So if things come up or you're really interested in learning more about stuff that we talk about today, or maybe interested in implementing things a little bit more intensely, please talk to a mental health or medical professional for further advice on what to do. Okay, with that being said, let's get started with this. So from the CDC, we know that there's a lot of kiddos struggling with anxiety. So when we look at ages 3 to 17, 7.1 kids have been diagnosed with anxiety as of, I think this was like March of last year. That's quite a lot of kiddos. And when we look over time, we can actually see that the percentage of kids having ever been diagnosed with anxiety has been increasing over time. And I do want to note that this last time frame here does have a wider age range. So instead of 6 to 17, it is 3 to 17. And that number is larger than the one on top because that's kids ever having been diagnosed, versus the 7.1% is kiddos who had a current diagnosis of anxiety. So the point being, it's really prevalent, and we do know that it has been increasing over time, and anxiety has certainly increased throughout the pandemic. We've seen that not just in kids, but also in adults. It's kind of across the spectrum here. And I do want to note that anxiety often co-occurs with other mental health conditions. So we do often see it with depression, ADHD, a lot of other kinds of behavioral struggles. It's a really, really common to see it co-occur. And it does become slightly more common as kids get older, right? So sometimes symptoms can get a little bit more intense. And it's just a little bit more prevalent as we get into older ages when we think about our kiddos. There's a lot of different kinds of anxiety. It looks very, very different when we think about from the mental health perspective, kids being diagnosed. These are some of the things we might be looking at: generalized anxiety, some of that social anxiety or phobia, separation anxiety. We might have specific phobias, and then some of that panic disorder, panic attacks. And this is by no means the only way anxiety could present, but these are some of the ones that come up quite a bit.
Say, Claire, I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you.
No
We just had
worries.
someone ask in the chat if you could speak just a little bit louder.
Oh, so sorry about that. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
So this is quite a long list of some of the symptoms we might see with anxiety. Most of these you'll probably be pretty familiar with. I do just want to touch on some of the ones bolded here. So irritability is a really big one. Often kids with anxiety, it can be those worries and kids that seem like they're just generally worriers, but it can also come across as irritability or even anger. Maybe there's something that does provoke anxiety, and instead of getting, gosh, I'm really stressed and worried about this, it comes out as that anger. So that is really common to see with anxiety, especially when we think about elementary aged kids. Disruptive behavior, we're going to talk a lot about the fight or flight response today. But I do want to mention what this looks like. So this can look like what maybe schools will call disruptive behavior. So the fight, it might be kids who are hitting, pushing, kind of yelling, throwing things. That can be very disruptive, and that can be our fight response because of some anxiety. And then the flight could be those kiddos maybe who at school run and hide under the desk, run out of the classroom. Maybe at home you're taking them to basketball practice and there's something about basketball that's making them really anxious and they run away. They don't want to get into the cards, things like that, that maybe you might have heard described as disruptive behaviors. Perfectionism, probably not going to be a surprise. What I do want to note with this is that it can include the failure to start or complete tasks. So it's not just that a task maybe has to be done perfectly. It can be that kids sometimes really struggle with completing a task and they don't want to complete it because they are worried it won't be perfect. So it can look like that as well. And on the other side here, we have a lot of those psychosomatic symptoms that we see with anxiety. And we're going to talk a lot about these tonight. Some I want to touch on are the stomach aches and headaches. Those are really common to see. And sometimes with stomach aches, it can be mistaken for hunger or just general pain. Sometimes kids with anxiety can't always differentiate between hunger and their stomach hurting. They don't really know what the difference is. And so at school, you might hear the kids needing to go to the bathroom or to the nurse quite frequently. And then digestive issues. This is a really big one that's not always talked about with anxiety. But this can look like struggles with diarrhea or constipation or just general digestive dysfunction, maybe irregularity in digestion and things like that. Not to say if a kiddo struggles with that, they have anxiety, but those can often be symptoms that we see when kiddos have had a lot of experience with anxiety. There's a lot of gut stuff that goes on here. So what I want to note before we kind of dive into things is that behavior is communication, right? So this is really hard to remember sometimes when a kid's really struggling and maybe they're kind of having a meltdown, really crying, maybe they're scratching themselves because they're so stressed and anxious. But it's important to remember that what a kid is doing is telling us something. The behavior is trying to communicate something to us. So if a kid isn't following directions at home, maybe they're nervous about the next activity, or maybe they can't organize tasks, right? So that would be more of that executive function concerns. But that tells us by thinking about what's being communicated, it can help us try to understand how we can best intervene and support this child, right? Are they communicating that they don't like the next activity? Are they communicating something else that they're anxious about, right? So it's helpful to think through some of those things. And then when we think about anxiety, I do just really briefly want to address, I hear from parents a lot, like, what could we have done differently? And the answer is, gosh, there's nothing you could have done differently. Anxiety is really complex, and a lot of mental health concerns are. You might have heard of nature versus nurture. Really, it's both. And we call this the diathesis stress model. So it's really saying that genetics and experiences impact our mental health. So we do know that there's a pretty strong genetic component for anxiety. It's very nuanced in specifically how that works and what's going on with the genes there. And every anxiety disorder is a little bit different, but there is a really, really strong genetic factor. So what this model is saying is, imagine we're all like a cup. We come to the table in life with some level of genetic predisposition. So our cups are filled to a certain extent, right? And that's different for everyone, as you can see across these three cups. And then we have different experiences throughout life. That's kind of our environment. That can be things that happen at home or just like bigger life events. Think COVID right now, right? That's a huge environmental stressor for kids. Access to media, right? Social media. Kids are accessing that a lot more frequently right now. So those are all big environmental things. So we might have a really small genetic predisposition, but gosh, COVID has been really hard. And that's really increased anxiety. So maybe what our cup is getting filled up with is a lot of environmental stuff right now, even though we don't have a lot of genetic predisposition. Or maybe we do have a lot of genetic predisposition. And that means we don't need a whole lot to happen in our environment for us to hit that threshold. When we hit that threshold, our cup spills over. Right? That's not when we develop anxiety. We certainly have symptoms of that beforehand, but that's certainly when we want to be seeking help, is when our cup is overflowing, or maybe when it's about to be overflowing. So just to note that there's a whole lot of complex stuff that's really going into anxiety here. And there's not a lot we can do about it always, right? We can try to do certain things within our environment, but a lot of it is environmental stuff that's completely out of our control. So I just kind of wanted to note that. Okay, let's talk about the brain. The brain is super cool. I love talking about the brain. This might be something you have seen before, left versus right brain. It's a pretty common image that people have seen. I've got my brain model right here. So the thing to note about the brain, and we're going to talk about this elementary age group generally right now, is that our left brain is really logical. It likes order, it's linear, it's literal. And then our right brain is really emotional and experiential. It's going to respond to a lot of nonverbal cues in our environment, and it's really heavily influenced by the body, right? So it's kind of really tuned into some of our bodily experiences. And the right brain does not care at all that all of these words are different colors, that they're not aligned, whereas the left brain, it really cares about that type of stuff. And the thing is that kids in that elementary age, they are really, really right brain dominant. So that means that when they're responding to different situations, it's going to be really heavily with that left side of the brain. So we can think about a situation maybe where you're painting at home and you run out of blue paint. Or maybe you are going to basketball practice and you say to your kid, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Your best friend isn't going to be there today. We just found out. The left brain is going to respond with, oh, okay. Well, I don't have blue paint. Maybe I could use some purple paint. Or maybe we can buy blue paint this weekend and then I can finish my painting. Or maybe with that basketball, it's thinking, well, my best friend's not going to be there. But that's okay. You know what? I have other best friends. I have other good friends that are going to be there. So I'll be okay. I'll still know people, have fun. Versus the right brain is like, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing ever, right? It can't have any of those like logical responses. It can't do that problem solving. And the thing with this is we don't want to have a response that's only right or only left brain. Even as adults, it's really unhealthy. We want to be integrating the sides of our brain. Because if we respond only with our left brain, it's kind of like an emotional desert. We're suppressing and denying the emotional state that we're in. And if it's the right brain, it's a lot of what we see in young kiddos, especially with anxiety, that kind of emotional flooding. So there's things we can do that we'll talk about later that can help us to help kids with anxiety in particular, integrate their right and left parts of their brain when we think about particularly stressful experiences. So that's kind of what's happening there. And then there's another way that we can start to understand brain function and kind of group parts of the brain. And this is the upstairs and downstairs brain. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about from this actually comes from a really wonderful book called The Whole Brain Child. And I have it here. If you have not read this book, I cannot recommend it enough. I recommend anybody who works with kids or has kids reads this book. It's really, really, really wonderful. It's not specific to anxiety, but most of what they talk about applies to kids with anxiety. And there's really wonderful tips and tricks. Some of them we'll talk about today. But very generally speaking, our downstairs brain, it's kind of roughly highlighted in orange here, is our limbic system and our brainstem. And its job is to keep us safe, right? So it's responsible for some of our basic functions like breathing. It watches for danger. It's constantly scanning our environment for danger. It's responsible for automatic reactions like our fight or flight response and really, really strong emotions. So for example, if you walk around the corner and someone jumps out and scares you, we don't stop and think, gosh, I wasn't expecting that. Oh, I have been a startle response. We just do it without thinking. That's our downstairs brain. You can think of it as it's all reaction with no real thinking, right? It doesn't necessarily reach the part of our brain that's responsible for some of our conscious thinking. And this part of the brain is really, really well developed at birth, which makes sense. It kind of has to be for us to survive. And this part of the brain is particularly important when we think about kids with anxiety. We have this part of the brain called the amygdala. It's really hard to see on here, so it's very generally circled in black here. It's kind of down in this part of our brain here. And it plays a really, really important role in processing emotions, specifically in processing fear. There's a lot of brain parts involved, but the amygdala is partially responsible for activating our fight or flight response, right? So when there's something dangerous, that's what's getting activated. And the amygdala is responsible for helping that process go along. So when our brain is scanning the environment, it's looking around and it's saying, gosh, there's some danger. The amygdala is activating our fight or flight response. And this is all happening without it reaching kind of our upstairs brain, which we'll talk about next. So it's not reaching our conscious thought always. And what we know from research is that kids who have anxiety actually have elevated activation of the amygdala, which means it's triggering their fight or flight response more frequently than in kiddos who don't have anxiety. So we do see a general difference in what's happening in their brains, right? So that fight or flight response, again, something we can't control, is being activated a lot more often in kids who have anxiety. So we have our downstairs brain. And then we have very generally our upstairs brain. This is kind of our cerebral cortex. Its job is really helping us think. It's responsible for making decisions, some of our executive functioning. So you can think planning, problem solving, sequencing, all of those types of functions. That's our upstairs brain. The thing with our upstairs brain, though, is it's not fully developed. Research now suggests until we're in our mid to late 20s, some even think into our like 30, right? So when we're looking at kids in elementary school, this part of the brain is really under construction. And it kind of makes sense. I'm sure you kind of can think about kids who have a really hard time sitting and regulating generally, right? It's because this part of the brain is still very much underdeveloped. And why these parts of the brain are so important is because they actually communicate with each other, right? So this image comes from the Whole Brain Child book. They kind of imagine it as a two-story house. And as with any two-story house, you need a way to get up and down. So there's a staircase. So that staircase is kind of like a metaphor for the communication between our upstairs and our downstairs brain. Another way we can think about this, I'm going to have you all hold up your hands. So you can hold up your hand and put your thumb over your palm like this. Our thumb and our palm are like our downstairs brain. That's our brainstem and our limbic system. And then you can fold your hand over. That's our upstairs brain. And you can see, kind of like in my model brain before I separated them, they're kind of real well connected. You know, they're really connecting and paying attention to each other, right? But the thing is, there's a couple of times where we lose communication, and kids in particular lose their communication between their upstairs and their downstairs brain. The first is a developmental piece. So because that upstairs brain is still under development, that staircase is pretty fragile. It doesn't always work, and we don't always have access to that upstairs functioning. So kids can't always, just developmentally where they are, they can't always process and use some of that logical thinking. That's something that we all develop over time. So just developmentally, first of all, kids in that elementary age range don't always have that capacity to communicate effectively with their upstairs brain. But then when the downstairs brain perceives a threat, it doesn't communicate with the upstairs brain. So when it's scanning the environment, remember that amygdala activates our fight or flight response. When that happens, it basically like shuts off that communication with the upstairs brain. The whole brain child gives a really lovely metaphor, but it's kind of like a baby gate. We cannot access our upstairs brain. And so what we actually call this is flipping our lid, right? So if you have your brain model with your fist, you'll pop up your fingers, we flipped our lid, right? And so in this case, our upstairs brain is nowhere near our downstairs brain. They cannot communicate with each other. So developmentally elementary aged kids, this is a struggle. They flip their lid, right? And this is something we all do, even as adults, right? We never don't flip our lid. We just get a little bit better at noticing signs and helping us to not do that. So kids have a hard time with that. Add on anxiety, right? So that amygdala is activating a lot more frequently, cutting off communication with the upstairs brain. Kids with anxiety are flipping their lids a lot more. And when they're in that state, so when we think about that anxious state, and it looks different for every kid. So maybe for some, it's that crying, kind of hugging themselves. Sometimes some kids it's scratch, maybe it's running away, whatever that looks like in that anxious state for them, that fight or flight response, they cannot access that thinking logical part of the brain. It's totally gone offline. And the thing with anxiety is that downstairs brain is going to react the same way sometimes to this hard question on a math homework and a bear in the house, right? And we can logically think, well, the bear is a much bigger threat. And maybe kids can also articulate that to you, but their downstairs brain can't, right? Because they have that kind of activated amygdala. It's activating a lot more frequently. So it's going to be activating at things that aren't a real threat to them, but the brain is perceiving it to be a threat. That's just kind of how their brains are functioning, right? So it's kind of hard as an adult, and some maybe even if you don't have anxiety, or maybe if you do, to think, well, just stop worrying about this. It's not that big of a deal, right? Their brains can't stop worrying about it because they've activated that fight or flight response. So it's happening a lot more frequently in young kiddos, and then in kiddos who have anxiety, right? So they don't have that ability to problem solve and regulate. We can also think about anxiety as like an alarm, right? So we have car alarms, fire alarms. Right? Their job is to protect us. They alert us when something's wrong. The amygdala kind of does the same thing in activating our fight or flight response and acts as our brain's alarm system. But kids with anxiety, that alarm system, it kind of goes off a lot on things that maybe it shouldn't, right? So you think about in the house, whenever that smoke detector goes off and there's no fire, it's the same kind of concept that's happening in their brain. It's going off when there's not a real threat, but the brain is perceiving there to be a threat. And what happens is then our fight or flight response kicks in, and it's activating what's called our sympathetic nervous system. And what that does is it directs our energy and our blood flow in our body to vital things, right? So things that are going to be helpful for us when we're fleeing or when we're fighting. So things like digestion kind of get shut down. There's not as much energy and blood flow going to our digestive system at that point in time. We also see an increase in heart rate, right? Because we got to get that heart rate up to get the adrenaline going, to keep us safe so we can run or so we can fight. We see higher blood pressure and stress hormones, specifically cortisol, increases in our body. And so for these kiddos who have anxiety, what's happening is really that their nervous systems are constantly on alert. And if any of you have ever had periods in your life where you've been really stressed about something, whether it's something about work or something personal, I bet you can anecdotally pull on, gosh, yeah, I was really tired. It was just kind of exhausting. And that's what's happening in kids with anxiety all the time, right? So their bodies are constantly on alert, and that's exhausting to their nervous system. I do want to note that not all stress is bad. We're talking about kids with anxiety. So they have a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress, and a lot of it isn't helpful. But stress and anxiety isn't inherently a bad thing, right? That alarm is there for a reason. It's to keep us safe. And there is a lot of research that suggests that we do need a certain level of stress in order to perform well. Think like in sporting events, on tests, things like that. So not all stress is bad, but it can get really unhelpful and really dangerous if we have these prolonged stress, particularly when we think about what you might have heard called toxic stress. That's a really common phrase to hear in media and when you kind of look things up. And so really prolonged stress can be really detrimental to our bodies, right? Because that nervous system is constantly being activated. And this is particularly true in kids who have experienced trauma. So that's a lot about the brain. But we also know that thoughts, behaviors, and feelings are really all interconnected. So our thoughts can actually physiologically change what's happening. Right? When kids are worrying about something, they start to worry, maybe it's about a test. Oh my gosh, I'm really worried. Am I going to do well? I'm so worried I'm going to fail. What if I don't know the questions? It starts to kind of activate some of those responses, right? Our heart rate starts to kick up. We might get a little sweaty. And remember, our downstairs brain is constantly scanning not only our environment, but our body to see what's going on. And it's picking up on that in our body. It's going, oh, yeah, our heart rate's kicking up. We're starting to sweat. Oh my gosh, there must be danger. That amygdala comes into play. We activate our fight or flight response, right? So you can see how they can cycle each other, and they're all really interconnected. And we do know generally that stress and anxiety can really impact our physical health. It can suppress our immune system, and it's linked to chronic inflammation, which are really detrimental things, specifically when we talk about gut and inflammation. Those worry thoughts, anxiety, is often accompanied by these what we call maladaptive thought patterns. When I work with kids, I will often call them helpful and unhelpful thoughts. So these maladaptive thought patterns or unhelpful thoughts are really common thought processes that we tend to see in kids with anxiety. So some of these might be really familiar too. So on one side, I have the unhelpful, on the other side, there's some of like the more helpful alternatives. And these are by no means the only ones that exist, just some of the ones that come up more frequently. Some I personally see a lot in my work are demanding perfection. I didn't get 100% on my math test. I'm a failure, even if we only got one wrong. And so what's more helpful is to help kids shift their thinking into learning how to forgive mistakes. Does that make me not smart? Does it make me a bad person? Right? So we can start to help them challenge some of those thought patterns. Focusing on the negative. This could be a kiddo who maybe they go to school and they get to watch a movie in school and they get popcorn and maybe it's a Friday and they come home and they get to play with a friend and they get to get takeout, right? So there's a lot of really good things that happen. But maybe you say they can't have ice cream, or maybe someone in class said something mean to them. And even though there were a lot of amazing things that happened that day, they're focused on that one negative thing. We kind of have a negativity bias as humans. Kids with anxiety have a really massive one. So they're really focusing on that one negative thing. We want to help them learn how to focus on the positive. And cognitions are like neural pathways in our brain. So you can think about that as a path in the grass. So the path that they use a lot is going to be really well worn down. There's not going to be a whole lot of new grass, right? Maybe it's even a paved path. It's that fast. There are those neural networks connecting those negative thought patterns. And for kids with anxiety, then those more helpful thoughts are harder to come by. And so when we try to help them learn these more helpful thought patterns, it's really hard. It's kind of like wading through really tall grass that doesn't have a path yet. We have to retrain their brain and some of their neural networks to focus on some of these things. That's what we can do in therapy, but that's also stuff that you as caregivers can do with kids and start to notice some of these thought patterns. The other two I really want to mention are catastrophizing. So worst case scenario, right? I didn't get 100% on my math test. I'm going to fail out of school. Worst case scenario, we're coming up with the worst. And we want to say, what is that realistic? Will I really fail out just because of one test? No, it's not really realistic, right? So we can help kids to kind of challenge some of those thoughts by thinking about like what's more probable. And then mind reading. This is actually probably one of the ones I see the most often. And I find it very closely tied to anxiety issues around self-esteem. So this is going to be when you're jumping to conclusions. Maybe a kid is walking down the hall and they see their best friend in the hall and they say hi and their friend kind of doesn't say anything back to them. What I see all the time is if I give kids that scenario or kids have told me that they do this thing is they'll think, oh my gosh, my friend hates me. What did I do? What did I do wrong? What's happening? I don't know. And they start to panic, right? So you get the worry thoughts, spirals into those physiological symptoms. We can activate our fight or flight response and we start to panic and worry. But they're jumping to conclusions. We can't read people's minds. What's the evidence that our friend doesn't like us anymore? Do we have evidence for that? Probably not. We usually don't, right? And so these helpful thoughts don't necessarily always go right. We can use like realistic thinking and looking for evidence to counter some of that jumping to conclusions in the mind reading. But these are really big thought patterns that we see a lot in kids with anxiety. And we'll talk a little bit more about what you can do as a caregiver. But one of the big things is just to start to name and notice these for kids that have anxiety. And you can start to notice patterns in yourself too. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, now we want to talk about anxiety and the gut. This is a newer area of research, so it's not as commonly talked about in some of these types of presentations, but I really want to spend some time focusing on this today. The brain and the gut communicate through what's called the vagus nerve that goes between our brain and our gut. It's like kind of like behind our vocal cords. It's like very generally back in here in our brain. And it's kind of like a two-way superhighway between our gut and our brain. And by gut, I mean like generally all the things involved in our digestive system. And it sends these chemical messages back and forth. And so when I talked about the fight or flight response, how it's activating what's called our sympathetic nervous system. Well, when we can stimulate our vagus nerve, we can actually help to activate what's called our parasympathetic nervous system. So you can think of them this way. Our sympathetic nervous system is kind of our fight or flight response. Our parasympathetic nervous system is our rest and digest nervous system. So it helps our body to calm down, brings all of the energy and the blood flow back to some of those basic functionings like our digestion. We can't flip a switch and turn off our sympathetic nervous system, but we can do things through techniques like breathing to help try to activate the vagus nerve, to stimulate that and activate our parasympathetic nervous system. So we know that there's a huge communication pattern happening between our brain and our gut. And there's a lot of research on the role that food plays. And the food we eat influences our microbiome and the microbiota in our guts, which then influences our brain. There's some research, and I'm not going to get into it because it's really nuanced in terms of the brain, but that the food we eat can actually influence specifically our amygdalas, right? And remember, our amygdala is partially responsible for activating our fight or flight response. And then we also know that those with anxiety have more inflammation, right? And so remember what we talked about, that sympathetic nervous system taking energy away from our gut. Kids with anxiety are constantly in that state. So they're not getting as much energy and blood flow focused on their gut, which is why we often see a lot of digestive issues in kids with anxiety, right? So I see a lot of kids with constipation, but it can look like diarrhea or oscillating, between the two and having really inconsistent gut issues. That's really common to see in kids with anxiety. And so what the research suggests, and again, this is really, it's a newer area of research, and by newer, I mean like 10, 20 years. So it's still quite substantial, but it's not like it's been like decades in the making here. And it is a little bit more limited in terms of kids. A lot of the research is specifically in adults, I will say that. But we do generally see that there is a relationship between unhealthy diet and poorer mental health in kids, specifically with anxiety. What the research is generally suggesting is that diets higher in levels of artificial sweeteners, sugar, and processed foods are generally associated with higher levels of anxiety, right? And we know that those are really detrimental long-term for other health concerns, but it's also true when it comes to our mental health and specifically anxiety. I also want to talk about nutrient deficiencies. This is a really big one. In my practice, one of the things I talk to my families about is I say, you know what, I really want you to go to your pediatrician and get a blood workup done. I just want to rule out that we're not working with any nutrient deficiencies here. Most insurance companies will cover a blood workup. And a lot of pediatricians are like, yeah, let's do this, because nutrient deficiencies can lead to or exacerbate mental health symptoms. So we can think about nutrients and minerals like iron, B vitamins. B vitamins are a pretty big one. You have to, there's reasons you're deficient in different things, but vitamin D, right? We live in Minnesota. We can all probably speak anecdotally about that one and how this time of the year we might start to get into a funk. Maybe some people get a little bit of seasonal affective disorder. The same is true in kids, right? And it's true across all of our nutrients. So if you have a kiddo who's really struggling and you are wondering if this is something you want to be concerned about or talk to a pediatrician about, go talk to your pediatrician, get a blood workup, particularly if it's also accompanied with higher levels of fatigue, because that's also another sign often that there's some kind of nutrient thing going on here. Again, it's not just anxiety. You might see a lot of other symptoms, but it's something to note that has a really big role in anxiety in kiddos. I want to talk about sleep. This probably isn't going to come as much surprise to any of you, but sleep is super important. The quality of our sleep impacts our ability to function during the day. Sleep deficiency is linked to anxiety. Sleep deficiency negatively impacts our decision-making, problem solving, and emotion regulation. So remember, that's all happening in our upstairs brain, right? So kids with anxiety, we're activating that fight or flight response quite frequently. They're flipping their lid. We're not able to access our upstairs brain, right? So then add on sleep deficiencies or problems with sleep. That becomes even worse. We're more likely to flip our lid. We have an even harder time accessing part of our brain that helps us with problem solving and emotion regulation. So when we're in an anxious state, those kids are having a lot harder time regulating. Maybe they're in that anxious state for a longer period of time than they might otherwise be. And then we think when kids are going to sleep, right? A lot of kids with anxiety struggle with worries when they fall asleep. That's kind of a time of the day where there's nothing else to distract them. So they can start to ruminate, and it can take a long time for kids to fall asleep. So those cognitions, that fight or flight response, remember that, they're all kind of coming together when we think about anxiety. And it's really important because it helps us to solidify our new neural pathways. So when we think about anxiety, often if kids aren't getting enough sleep or enough quality sleep or are really struggling with their sleep, that might actually be the first avenue we have to focus on in order to help them with their anxiety, right? Because we can't do a whole lot if kids can't develop those new neural pathways, right? We think about those neural pathways we talked about with cognitions and helping them to think of more helpful thoughts. Sleep is a vital component of helping them get to do that. So sleep, again, is really important. And we want to talk about movement. We know that aerobic exercise has been proved to reduce anxiety and stress. True for adults, true for kids. It can help with our cognitive function and self-esteem, and it can improve sleep. So think about those kids with anxiety who are really struggling with their sleep. I am not telling you your child needs to exercise and work out, not at all. But we do know that movement throughout the day is really important. So if kids are going home after school where they have to sit all day, right, they don't get a whole lot of movement right now in school. And they're coming home playing on the computer or they're playing video games. They're not getting a lot of movement in. And we know that having more movement can actually help to decrease some of those anxiety symptoms. And then play. I cannot stress enough the importance of play in kids of this age for all reasons, but particularly when we think about anxiety. Play reduces stress. There's a lot of really solid research on this. It's allowing for the integration of our left and right brain, right? So that logical and that emotional brain that's helping kids learn how to integrate those, which is really vital. It's also building up our distress tolerance and helps develop that upstairs brain, right? So we think about kids with anxiety flipping their lid a lot more often. Play can help them learn how to use their upstairs brain, connect it to solidify that staircase and make it a stronger staircase of communication. It also promotes the development of social skills. There's a lot of research on this, particularly in kids. And I bring this one up because a lot of kids struggle with anxiety around social situations. It might be social anxiety specifically, but it could just be like worrying about what other peers are thinking of them, worrying that they're going to say the wrong thing generally. It might not be the level of of social anxiety disorder, but it could have flavors of that or be one of the things that they worry about. So play is really important. And I really stress this because kind of in our culture today, kids don't really get enough play. They're involved in a lot of structured activities, which is awesome. It's so important for them. You know, they still get to see friends that way, but structured activities are not the same as play. So it's really important for kids to get that play. And through play, they often get movement. Think play of like, I'm at home, like creatively playing with blocks and building things, or with dolls, or playing make-believe in the backyard, or downstairs in the basement, or in my room, whatever it is. That's the kind of play we're talking about here. It's really, really vital for kiddos. So that's all fine and well. There's a lot of information I just threw at you. I recognize that. And that's a lot to take in. So now I want to go through all of those again, and we'll talk about different ways you can respond, right? Because we can see that they're all very, very interconnected. So this is going to come from the whole brain child again. And I think it's so important to talk about it this way. So one of the things we can do when we flipped our lid, remember, we don't have access to that upstairs brain, some of that problem solving and thinking skills. So you think, gosh, what do we do? Well, we connect. That is step one. So we say connect to redirect. So connecting is getting in touch with that emotional side of the brain. Remember that downstairs brain. We can do that through touch, tone, empathy, our facial expressions, pausing, having some of those meaningful pauses, and getting on kids' eye level. I can't stress that one enough, actually. I very frequently see kids who are dysregulated. And, I've worked with a lot of parents who I notice, like, wow, we're not getting down on their level. Like, sit down on the floor with them if that's where they are, right? Lay down on the floor, even if they're that dysregulated. It kind of shows, it's a way to show that we're with them and we're empathizing with them. And so some of this is going to look like things where you're basically kind of saying, in whatever terms you're comfortable with your family, like, that sucks. Yeah, this is really hard for you right now. You are super worried about going to this birthday party and what other people are going to think. I get that. This is hard. So you see, I can use my tone, my facial expressions. I'm making kind of big facial expressions, pauses, sometimes those sighs to really connect with that emotional state. And once we get there, we can get their nervous systems to start to sync up with ours if we're calm, and then we can redirect, right? So we can use our words like planning, logic, limits, boundaries, right? That's when we can do more of that reflection piece. And it's a hard thing, but when a kid has flipped their lid and they are that anxious, there's not a whole lot we can do other than connect with them. And that's, again, why I really recommend this book, The Whole Brain Child, if you have not read it. They have a lot of really, really wonderful examples in here of some of the ways you can do that and what this looks like. The other thing I want to talk about is tame it to name it. Again, coming from The Whole Brain Child, that's kind of their phrase they use. But this is really important for kids with anxiety. If there's a specific situation that's happened or going to happen that they're really stressed about. The idea is that we have to talk about these feelings. When I work with families with anxiety, one of the things I see quite frequently is it's really hard when kids flip their lid, so we try to avoid it. And what then ends up happening is that families will often try to not trigger a child. So if a kiddo gets really stressed and worried when they don't know the plan, and your plan on Saturday is like to go to the zoo, and all of a sudden it's raining and you say, gosh, we were going to go outside at the zoo. There's not a whole lot to do inside. Let's change our plan. And they get really anxious because now they don't know what the plan is, right? And they're maybe crying, yelling, screaming, maybe they're scratching, maybe they're running away. That's really, really hard to manage. But what we want to do is help them name that emotion. This is really hard for you. And then we retell the story, right? So it could be something like that. It could be a scary event that happened. Maybe you have a kiddo who has a really specific phobia and they've been exposed to that. And then we've calmed down. Now we want to tame it to name it. So what's going to be is retelling the story. And you're helping this kiddo retell the story. So you do that by talking about what happened. So we can talk about the sequence of what happened. Okay, well, first I went to a birthday party and it was away from mom and dad. So I went to a party and I was really scared and nervous and I didn't know anyone there. And I was looking around and there weren't any friends. And then I saw somebody I knew. Oh my gosh, that was a good friend from class. I don't really talk to them a lot, but I got to go see them. And then we started playing and then I had fun, right? So we can help them tell that event. We can tell what happened. Okay, first, second, third, right? Go through the logical side of it and then help them integrate that emotional side of it too. So what were you feeling? And what's typically going to happen when we do this with kids is we're going to get a little bit of activation, right? We're starting to trigger some of those feelings again, of those anxiety feelings. And that's okay. Because when we ignore anxiety and we ignore situations that trigger anxiety, we're not actually helping kids. We're not helping the anxiety going away. We're actually kind of making it worse a lot of the time. One of the best things we can do is help kids learn and teach their brains that they can get through the anxiety. And so there's really concrete ways we can do this in therapy, right? So I'm not saying, go do exposure therapy with your kids. Absolutely not. You need a therapist for that type of work. But there's things you can do as a caregiver to help them get through those things. And that's kind of retelling that story. Again, remember, we're integrating our left and our right brain, the logical and the emotional side of it. And so they might get a little bit activated, but they're not quite flipping their lid. And then you can retell the story again. And maybe they're going to get a little less activated. We're not quite bubbling up as much. So they're getting through retelling the story with less and less anxiety. And it's reteaching the brain that we don't have to have that physiological stress, anxiety, fight or flight response to that situation, which makes it more likely that they're going to have a different response in the future. We're going to have a calmer response to a similar situation in the future. And when you do this, young kids, they can't sit down and have this kind of conversation. Maybe you have some kids who can do that, especially if we're thinking like 4th, 5th graders. But often what needs to be, you can sit down and like play with blocks, build, do something else while you're talking about this. Or maybe you can draw it out with kids. I do that a lot with kiddos who don't really have that capacity to talk about their feelings in that same way that maybe some of the older kids do. So that's a really great way to approach this one as a caregiver. And then respond calmly. It's really hard not to have yourself become dysregulated when you're working and dealing with a kiddo who's flipped their lid, but it's really important. We didn't have time to get into this, but we have what are called mirror neurons, which help our nervous systems to sync up. So if we can remain calm and connect on that emotional level with the kid, then what's going to happen is their nervous system is going to sync up with ours, right? So they're going to start to activate that parasympathetic nervous system and they're going to calm down and regulate. Allow for the flexibility. It doesn't have to be like, we're going to sit down and talk about this. You can do it while you're doing other things. Praise behaviors you want to see. So we know from research, reinforcement is much more effective than punishment. And anxiety, remember, they can't help it, right? They're flipping their lid. That's not in their control. And so when we're praising things, praise the coping skills they're using. I love the way that you regulated your body. I love the way you used a breathing skill to try to calm down there. I love the way you identified what that negative thought was and tried to make a new thought. Things like that. Praise those behaviors and model them yourself. If you think, maybe you can say, oh gosh, I'm really nervous today because I have to give a presentation at work. I'm kind of nervous about what other people will think and if they find it helpful. And oh my gosh, what if no one likes it and everyone hates it, right? And then you can think, oh, wait, that's unhelpful thinking. It's more helpful to think about the positive things. Okay, well, even if I help one person, I've done a good job, right? And you can kind of reframe it yourself with your own examples in your life for your child to help them learn how to do that. So we want to model it. Identify alternative behavior. So if a kid is in their flight response and they're running away, find a spot in the house where it's acceptable for them to run to, right? Maybe it's a place where you can access them. Maybe it's a place where they have tools to help their bodies calm down. If they're scratching, I see that a lot with anxiety, give them a squishy ball, right? So we're not taking the behavior away. We're just trying to give them something different that's acceptable because they still need to get a behavior out. Using breaks, it can be really hard to talk about these things, so make sure you're using breaks. Staying consistent is really big. One of the things I hear a lot is we're trying these strategies, Claire, and it's not really working. And I say, yeah, well, we really want them to work right away. It's really hard that they don't, but it takes us a while. Remember, even for adults, it takes 30 days on average to build a habit. So for kids, it's going to be similar. We have to model it and try it a lot of the time. We can stimulate the vagus nerve. Remember, we talked about that as our kind of super highway between our gut and our brain. We can stimulate it through things when we stimulate our vocal cords. It's really cool. So you can get kids to hum, to breathe really deeply, to gargle, to sing. All of that can stimulate our vagus nerve. Deep breathing. If anyone does yoga breath, where you constrict the muscles in your throat and you breathe if you haven't done yoga, it's kind of a weird noise. It's like a really loud breathing through your nose. That stimulates our vagus nerve. And other kinds of deep breathing can be really beneficial. When a child has flipped their lid, they're not in a state where they can do that. So one of the ways we can help them is by starting to notice what the triggers are, right? So an activity I'm really going to encourage you all to go do is to write down what you see when your kid has flipped their lid, but then start to write down what you see when they're about to. What are those signs and triggers? That's when we want to use breathing. One of my favorite ones to get kids to breathe is to hold up my hand and I say, okay, this is like a birthday cake. You ever blown out candles on a birthday cake? I want you to pretend each of my fingers is a candle. And I'll have them blow them out like a candle. So we go, and we go through all the fingers. The reason I like that is because it's really hard for kids to deep breathe. Usually what they do is they go, right? And that's not a deep breath. We need it to be kind of that long breath to stimulate our vagus nerve. And then mindfulness. There's a lot of research that increased mindfulness actually helps us with emotion regulation. So you can do mindfulness with your kiddo at home. That could be 5 minutes of quiet coloring. It's not necessarily like sitting and meditating. That's not mindfulness. It can be writing down our thoughts. That's a really huge one, especially if you have older kiddos in the older elementary. That's a really great strategy to use to start to notice thought patterns. And again, with our cognitions, remember, we're helping them to notice their worry thoughts, naming them for them, modeling it for them, helping them identify those helpful and unhelpful thoughts, and then praising when you see it. So another strategy then is to help them write it down. What are your thoughts? What are your worry thoughts today? Here are some really wonderful worry books that you can use. The first one, Mind Over Mood, is actually for adults, but it's a really lovely one. We know anxiety has a genetic component. So if you also struggle with anxiety as a caregiver, this is a really awesome one that you could do. And then you can adapt it with your kid, or you can have your kiddo do one of these other ones. Mindfulness for kids who worry is a really great one. Has really lovely exercises you can write in it. Kids might need some adult help with it. I recommend that one for teachers a lot too. They're really fun activities that teachers can do in their classes with kids. And then Put Your Worries Here. This one says it's for teens, but I've worked with a lot of kiddos in elementary school who do this one, and it's really fun. It's a lot of writing and drawing stuff. And so when you're working, if you have little kids in the younger elementary, it doesn't have to be writing our thoughts. It can be drawing pictures of our worry thoughts, right? And typically what I see is kids start to say, I don't know what I'm worried about. That's fine. We need to practice identifying it. So just practicing thinking about it is half of the step. The gut, not really going to be a big surprise here, I think, but including more whole plant-based foods, reducing sugar and processed foods. I'm not telling you to change your diets by any means. If you are interested in doing this type of stuff, you please seek out a pediatrician, a dietitian for this type of stuff. The idea here is that there's maybe small things that you can change, right? Or start to think about it. My goal here is to help you understand that this plays a massive role in anxiety. So this can be an avenue that you can explore with a mental health provider, with a pediatrician. If you are trying to increase the amount of produce, frozen produce is awesome. There's less waste, and it's just kind of generally easier. It's also a lot less expensive because you can buy it in bulk. And what happens is frozen produce is frozen right after it's picked. So it has all the nutrients from right after it's picked, versus produce in the produce section at the grocery store. Well, it's still nutrient packed and a little bit less because it's had more time to lose the nutrients as it's been transported and sitting out in the grocery store. Check labels. Often what I say to families is, you know what, just start small. I get it. You live a really busy life. Maybe you're working. You don't have the time and energy to devote for this, or maybe you don't have the means, and that's okay. Maybe you just think about, okay, we're going to reduce the amount of sugar in our cereal that we eat for breakfast, and that's all, right? But just know that you can check labels, make really small changes. And again, if you're thinking of making massive changes, please consult with mental health professional, with doctor, with the dietitian. Really drastic changes to diet are really detrimental to our health. And if we suddenly increase the amount of fiber we're getting, it can actually be really detrimental to our gut. These types of stuff has to happen really slowly. Sleep is really important. The two biggest things I should say I see are an inconsistent routine with kids, and then inconsistent wake up and bed times. So kids have to wake up really early for school, particularly in elementary school, and then often they get to sleep in or stay up late on weekends. What happens on Monday morning is actually a form of jet lag. So it can be really detrimental to kids, especially when we think about that sleep deficiencies. Mondays can be really hard. So it's really important to create a sleep routine, especially if kids worry a lot at nighttime, right? There's different things we can implement. Headspace, Calm, there's different apps. Maybe they listen to a story before bed. Maybe you're working on identifying those worries, right? And then avoiding too much food and drink before bed, especially like those caffeinated, like sugary drinks, are really detrimental to the quality of sleep and our ability to sleep through the night. And movement. I am not at all telling you your child needs to exercise. Please don't take that away from this. That's actually really detrimental. That's not something they should be thinking about at this point in time. The idea is just allow for more unstructured play. Like I said before, kids don't get enough of that in how our society works today. So it's really important that we can incorporate more of that. And if it's hard, maybe you do more movement, like a walk around the block together, or maybe you play catch in the backyard. Catch is actually a really great way to regulate kids too, right? When you're playing catch and tossing something back and forth, you're activating mirror neurons, and that can be a form of regulation for kiddos, especially if we haven't quite reached the flipping our lip stage. And again, like I said, be careful with exercise. So when does this become a problem? Really, you need to be seeking out mental health professionals' advice. and when functioning is impacted. So social, relational, educational functioning. And so that's social is going to be like peer relationships, friendships, and relational is more like the family, nuclear unit relationships, those types of things. And with anxiety, like I said, it's really easy to miss it. And it's really easy for families to modify their lifestyles and schedules so that kids with anxiety aren't getting triggered, because that's really hard to deal with. I get it. But when that's happening, it means that your kid isn't actually functioning. Because if you took away all of those different things, they still wouldn't be able to regulate and manage their anxiety. So those are all signals that we might be wanting to seek out the help of a mental health professional, because it's our job then to help kids learn how to really manage that anxiety. And then note that when kids aren't feeling well emotionally, they can't engage. So they're not able to engage in school. They're not able to engage in friendships. And note that you're their parent, not their therapist. There's, I hope, things you got away from today and strategies you can use, but your job isn't to change or fix this. Right? That's our job as therapists. That's where we get to come, and your job is still to be their parent. And then a therapist can help you with your individual needs and what your family needs with your kiddos' own presentation of anxiety, if they have their own health issues, all of those things. Pediatricians can help with medication and nutrition. Medication can be a really good step when it comes to anxiety, because sometimes what it does, it allows us to get to a state where we can do some of the other work. And then once we can get some of the coping skills going and some of the other strategies in place for kids, then we can maybe start to think about titrating medication or going off of it. But for kids who have really, really intensive anxiety, often we do want to explore medication, at least temporarily, so that we can at least get to a point of functioning where we can learn some of these other skills. Psychiatrists are also really great for helping with medication as our nurse practitioners. And then seek out a mental health provider. And then nutritional psychiatry is kind of the like key phrase right now for some of the brain gut connection stuff. Psychiatrists aren't the only people who have specialties in this, but that is kind of like a buzz phrase right now, if that's something you're interested in learning more about.